Part 1. When God says no, there are moments in life when our prayers feel like they should come true. When everything in us whispers the same hope, surely God will say yes to this. We stand with open hands, with faith burning bright, believing that our desire aligns perfectly with God's plan. But then the answer comes. Not the one we imagined, not the one we begged for. The answer is no. That single word can shake the strongest heart. It can make faith feel foolish. It can make hope feel like a cruel trick. And when God's no comes, after we've poured out every tear, every sleepless night, every desperate prayer, it can leave us shattered. You are not the first person to feel this way. There was once a king, a man after God, his own heart, who heard the same answer. His name was David. David's story began with courage. He faced down giants and conquered enemies because he believed in the God who strengthened his hand. Through years of running from danger, through seasons of fear and waiting, he held on to one truth. God had chosen him for a purpose, and when he finally became king, when the battles quieted and the walls of Jerusalem stood firm, David looked at the palace he lived in, carved from the finest cedar, standing strong and beautiful. And a thought stirred in his heart. How can I live in a palace while the ark of God remains in a tent? It didn't sit right with him. Not after everything God had done. Not after the victories, the protection, the promises fulfilled. He wanted to build a home for the Lord, a temple worthy of his presence, a place that would shine with glory. David shared this desire with the prophet Nathan, and even the prophet agreed. Do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. David's heart soared. This was his moment, his greatest legacy, the dream that made every hardship worth it. But that night, Nathan heard from God, and the message was unexpected. David was not the one who would build the temple. God had a different plan. Tell my servant David, God said, you are not the one to build a house for me. A simple sentence, but imagine how it struck David. He had fought the battles. He had united the kingdom. He had kept his faith through trial after trial. Finally, when he wanted to do something beautiful for God, God said no. Not because David lacked faith, not because his dream was wrong, not because God didn't love him, but because the purpose belonged to someone else. His son, a king yet to rise, would finish what David began. God's no wasn't a rejection, it was a redirection. Yet, in that moment, that truth didn't erase the sting. David had to face the silence between what he longed for and what God allowed. Maybe you've stood in that same place. You prayed for the relationship to survive, but it ended. You asked for healing, but the pain remained. You begged for the door to open, but it closed tighter instead, and you whispered through tears. Why, God? Why not me? Why not now? You believed you were ready. You believed you were right. You believed your plan was good, just like David. But when God says no, he rarely gives his reasons right away. He asks us to trust him, even when our hearts feel broken. David could have turned away. He could have been angry, bitter, prideful. He could have clung to his dream and forced it into reality. But instead, he bowed. He surrendered the dream he loved into the hands of the God he loved more. Because David understood something only the faithful can see. When God denies a desire born from love, he is preparing a purpose born from eternity. Even if we don't understand it yet. So here is the truth that part 1 leaves us with. God's no is not the end. It is the beginning of a different story. A better story. Even if it doesn't feel that way now. Your tears do not mean failure. Your heartbreak is not wasted. Your prayer was heard. Your faith was seen. This no is not a wall. It's a doorway. A doorway leading somewhere you can't yet imagine. And the God who loves you, the God who sees every hidden ache, will walk through it with you. Because his refusal is not rejection. It is protection. It is redirection. It is love disguised in disappointment. Part 2. When God said no to David's dream, the silence must have echoed inside his soul. He had spent years chasing God's heart, and now that heart seemed to turn him away. It's easy to picture the scene. The king standing on the rooftop of his palace, looking toward the tent that held the Ark of God. The sunset burns over Jerusalem, its light touching the hills like fire. The city hums with life. But inside David there is only stillness, the sound of a dream dying. Maybe you've stood in that same stillness when you did everything right, and yet the answer was still no. That's when the enemy whispers, "See, you weren't good enough." God doesn't care. Your prayers don't matter. But those are lies. Because God's no is never cruel. His no always carries meaning. It's just that the meaning unfolds slowly, like dawn after the longest night. David soon began to understand that God wasn't punishing him. He was protecting him. "You have shed much blood," God told him, "and fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name." David's life had been one of battle, of conquest, of survival. He had lived with the sword in his hand and fire in his heart. The temple, the place of peace, of rest, of worship, needed to be built by someone who would rule in peace. That man would be his son, Solomon. At first, this must have pierced David's pride. The temple had been his dream. The idea that it would belong to someone else, even his own child, must have hurt. But instead of letting pride consume him, David began to see something far greater. God's no was actually a promise. When God told David he wouldn't build the temple, he followed it with words that changed everything. "The Lord declares to you that he will make you a house, and your throne will be established forever." To Samuel 7:11-16, David wanted to build God a house made of stone. God wanted to build David a house made of legacy, a dynasty that would lead to Jesus Christ, the true king who would reign forever. Think about that. David asked for something good, but God gave him something eternal. Sometimes, when God says no, it's not because what you want is wrong, but because it's too small. You're asking for a house of cedar, while he's planning a kingdom that never ends. When God closes one door, it is often because he is opening a door that leads farther than you could have dreamed. You see one chapter. He sees the whole story. Still, that doesn't make it easy. Because God's no is not just a change of direction. It is a test of trust. Can you trust him when you don't understand him? Can you still worship when your plans fall apart? Can you still believe he's good when your heart feels broken? That's the moment that separates a believer from a disciple. David could have sulked. He could have stepped back from faith and said, "Fine, if I can't have my dream, I'll do nothing." But he didn't. He leaned closer. He said, "Lord, who am I that you have brought me this far?" It was the voice of a man who realized that God's no didn't diminish his love. It proved it. In that humility, something began to shift inside David. Instead of building the temple himself, he decided to prepare the way. He gathered gold, silver, cedar, and stone. He organized the craftsmen, the priests, and the singers. He wrote psalms of worship that would one day fill the temple walls with praise. He gave Solomon every resource he would need to finish what God had started. David built what he could, not for his own glory, but for God's. He understood something few ever do. Sometimes God says no to your dream so that he can use you to prepare someone else's. And that realization changed everything. The no that once hurt became an invitation to trust deeper. The rejection became redirection. The disappointment became destiny. Because David's dream didn't die, it simply passed through him into eternity. You might not see the outcome of what you prayed for. You might not get the job, or the healing, or the relationship you wanted. But your obedience can still plant a seed, one that blooms long after you're gone. Your no today might be the foundation of someone else's yes tomorrow. And maybe that's the beauty of it all. When God says no, he isn't denying your faith. He's multiplying it across generations. As David looked over the plans for the temple, he could finally smile. He knew he wouldn't walk inside those walls, but he would leave behind the blueprint of obedience. And that, in the end, was worth more than any crown. Because sometimes the greatest honor is not building the dream. but preparing the way for the one who will. Part 3. There's something sacred about surrender. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's quiet, a heart finally unclenching its grip on what it thought it needed most. That's what David did. He didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply bowed before the will of God. And in that surrender, he discovered something extraordinary. God's no didn't end his story. It transformed it. Years later, as the aging king looked back over his life, he could see it all more clearly. The wilderness years, the battles, the waiting, the heartbreak, and now, the redirection. Every closed door, every denied dream, each one had led him closer to God, not farther away. He realized that God's no had been his mercy in disguise. Had David been allowed to build a temple himself, maybe pride would have taken root. Maybe he would have glorified the work of his hands instead of the grace of his God. But now David could see that the true temple wasn't made of stone or gold. It was made of faith, of obedience, of trust. When Solomon was finally crowned king, David stood before the nation of Israel one last time. His hair had turned silver. His hands trembled as he lifted them to the crowd. But his eyes burned with that same fire, not the fire of ambition, but of worship. He spoke words that would echo through generations. My son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the work is great. For the temple is not for man, but for the Lord God. 1 Chronicles 29:1. Then he gave everything he had, his personal treasures of gold and silver, to help build the house he would never enter. The people saw their king's humility and followed his example. Together, they gave so generously that the scriptures say they rejoiced greatly, for they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord. David's dream hadn't been denied. It had been multiplied. What he started in prayer, his son would finish in glory. And long after the temple was built, David's legacy would live on. Not in marble or cedar, but in every song, every psalm, every heart that learned to trust God's timing instead of their own. Maybe that's what God is doing in you right now. You can't see it yet. You only feel the ache of disappointment, the sharp pain of unanswered prayers. You keep asking why the door won't open, why the healing hasn't come, why the silence feels endless. But what if this no is not punishment? What if it's preparation? What if God no is the soil from which something far greater will grow, something that could never exist if he had said yes too soon? Because when God says no, he's not saying, I don't love you. He's saying, I love you too much to let you settle. Think of every person who's heard that divine refusal. Moses prayed to enter the promised land. God said, no. Paul begged for the thorn in his flesh to be removed. God said, no. Even Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, prayed, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. And still, the Father said, no. But in every no, there was a greater yes hidden behind it. Moses' no led to a new generation entering promise. Paul's no led to grace that strengthened countless souls. And Jesus' no. The cross became the greatest yes in all of history. So if you're standing in a season where heaven seems silent, where prayers bounce off the ceiling, where God's answer is not what you hoped, take a deep breath. Remember David. Remember Moses. Remember Jesus. Remember that your story isn't finished because one dream didn't come true. Sometimes, God has no as the bridge that leads to the miracle you couldn't see. Imagine, David would one day pass from this world, but his name would echo for centuries. From his line came Solomon, and from Solomon's line came Christ, the son of David, the Savior of the world. A single no in one generation became redemption for all generations. That's what happens when faith chooses surrender over resentment, when you let go of what you wanted and trust the one who knows what you truly need. So maybe it's time to stop asking why didn't it happen and start whispering, what are you doing through this? Because every no from God is still an answer, and every unanswered prayer still lives in his hands. You might not see the temple you dreamed of. You might never step into the place you imagined. But one day, you'll stand before him and you'll see what he was building all along. a heart that trusted him through the pain, a soul refined by surrender, a faith stronger than any yes. Could have made it. When God says no, He's not closing a door to punish you. He's guiding you to a promise beyond your understanding. He's not taking something from you. He's making something through you. Because His no is never the end of your story. It's the turning point of His greater one.